So recently I installed a Fallout New Vegas Wabbajack mod list called High and Dry. Incredible looking list, amazing texture work. Every single element of the game has been examined, issues have been addressed, cut content has been re-added, new features have been added, the engine itself has been tweaked. This ancient technology held together with bubblegum and duct tape, the secrets of achieving a somewhat tolerable performance continued to elude me for years. And I played it at release on the PS3 and the performance was abysmal, frankly. But, we finally made it. Here we are. I'm playing High and Dry in 4K. It's a pretty consistent 60 FPS locked, 0 frame time issues, Vulkan API compatibility injected into the engine. It's a testament to the talent and the tenacity of the Bethesda modding community, and of course they have their issues. Nexus Mods, the website especially, is completely saturated with culture warriors, leftoids, troons, who of course ban any mod that might be even remotely based, How about adding the incel trait to New Vegas? An extra 10% damage to women, but a minus 5-point charisma penalty. A German National Socialist makeover for Caesar's Legion, perhaps? No female raiders in Fallout 3, no blacks in Starfield, just basic quality of life mods, really. And thankfully, you can still find a lot of this stuff on sites like Based Mods, which is a great site I'd recommend for anyone looking for a little bit more of an edgy modding experience, right? But when all is said and done, it's time to play a little New Vegas, and for me, I enjoyed this game a lot. I preferred it to Fallout 3. It is my favorite Fallout game. Because of course, this is an Obsidian-developed game. These are the developers who worked on the original PC isometric Fallout games. Chris Avallone and company, a developer who was Me Too'd and shunned from the industry in recent memory. Many such cases, even including fellow Bethesda employee Jeremy Soule, who was also implicated in some kind of sexual harassment suit. But there's something to be said for the longevity of this game. People are still enjoying it 15 years after it came out, due in no small part thanks to the depth and the relative freedom, especially by today's standards, of the role-playing elements, the ability to create a character that's grounded in the lore and the world and represents a certain moral point of view, a certain political perspective. This game is not afraid to give the player real choice. Avallone and his team had a very old-school approach to developing like a Western RPG. Of course, this is a 3D Fallout game. Very different gameplay to the original PC games that came out in the 90s, right? But when compared to Fallout 3 and even 4, tonally, New Vegas is a little bit closer to the original 90s CRPGs. Perhaps not quite as bleak, but it's appreciated. Having a darker tone in this post-apocalyptic setting kind of balances out the satirical elements, which I feel that Fallout 3 lent into a little too heavily. To the point where it kind of takes me out of the experience a little bit. Again, you find it hard to suspend your disbelief when every NPC is a ridiculous cartoon character. New Vegas really doesn't have this issue. It seems like the voice recording sessions were directed better, the script itself, a big improvement. The NPCs feel more like characters. It's very, very good. And we also have some great celebrity voice work. Matthew Perry voicing the iconic Benny. It's one of the coolest roles he's ever been allowed to play, and it was in a Fallout game, right? Rest in peace, Matthew Perry. Let's pour one out for Perry. Somewhat of a Gentile minstrel, a token goy. To me, he'll always be Benny, and what a cool character. But again, it leans more into this Vegas 50s vibe, Rat Pack, Sinatra. Circa 1958. A time in American history and culture where men were allowed to be men, men were masculine. That's what the Rat Pack were all about, right? Celebrity bros hanging out with organized Italian criminals, of course. Full-time functional alcoholic Dean Martin doing stand-up, booze flowing, gorgeous women, severe and reckless gambling habits indulged to the fullest extent. The finest tailored suits, the finest cigars, peak Vegas. A halcyon period of American cultural supremacy, soon to be washed away forever by the incoming tumult of the following decade. An old faded yellow photograph of the briefest of moments frozen in time, when everybody thought that things were going to be okay in the end. This alternate universe pastiche of the optimism of American post-war 1950s society. Not quite a parody in that there's a lot of reverence for the era shown within these games, New Vegas especially. This 50s futurism. It was this aspirational culture of the World War II generation, the greatest generation. If you're a millennial, it's our grandparents' generation, right? And it's the same culture that was annihilated in the countercultural revolution of the 1960s, a definitional period for the baby boomers. They take great pride in the part they played, completely reshaping the society that their parents left to them. And really, I enjoy Fallout and New Vegas especially because, it channels some of this cultural basedness unique to the boomers' parents. Not to say that they, as a generation, didn't have their own unique issues, but frankly, they had a lot of things right. Much like the grand and epoch-defining plans of a man like Mr. House, they had a different vision for the future of their nation. Henry Ford or Walt Disney or Howard Hughes, the boomer generation's personal political crusade was to destroy that beautiful dream their parents dreamt. The unalloyed civilizational fantasy of the greatest men of the greatest generation, vaporized before their very eyes, almost in an instant, and at the treacherous whim of their own children to boot, the cruel joke of the 20th century played on. After having stared death in the face, it all comes down to this. This is what we fought for, this is what we died for. One can only imagine the anguish felt in the heart of the aging World War II veteran, watching as decade after decade, the entire world warping and shunting into one giant circus big top. A star of Remphan emblazoned onto its garish facade. Perverse, demonic, absurd, humiliating in equal measure. A true vision of hell, perhaps worse, perhaps more harrowing than even the post-apocalyptic wasteland of Fallout New Vegas. A place where the sheer scale of the civilizational betrayal somehow feels less horrifying in its purity of total nuclear apocalyptic Armageddon than trying to come to terms with the reality of modern society and its true history. The boomers are, to this day, stewards of this post-World War II Nuremberg regime paradigm, basically stepping over Gen X entirely, which is almost like a religion in and of itself. There are sacred cows that must be protected at all costs, the civil rights movement, certain attitudes towards race, gender dynamics, economics and politics, spirituality or a lack thereof. An entire generation of moral nihilists lost forever in a hole of mirrors, doomed. But, I guess there are two types of people in this world. There are some that view life as a game, not to be taken too seriously, and that the pursuit of novelty is an end in and of itself, that life is a ride. To be enjoyed in this hedonistic fashion, YOLO. Life's too short, don't concern yourself with anything too heavy. Because it's all just a ride, man, sparks doob, and then there's another type of human being that views life as a war, as in conflict being the defining characteristic of living within this shared PvP server that we call reality. The boomers' parents, of course, they saw that not only was life a war, but the reality of war, up close and personal, is not the same as propaganda. It's not the same as what you would see depicted in comic books, or as the scenarios and the narratives emitting from their cathode ray tube televisual devices that, once integrated into the household, create a fixed perception of reality and of society that can be nudged and manipulated in an increasingly Bernaysian fashion as post-World War II Freudian ideas leak into the ad marketing infrastructure, and further still into the public consciousness, women smoking at the whim of the arch Frankfurt School, Aldmeri elven puppet master, By the late 50s, you could smell the revolution in the air, the rock and roll, darkening, the Trotskyite beatniks, the fog and paranoia of the Cold War. This incoming period of cultural revolution really changed everything, and thus began the end of history. The path set the road that would ultimately lead to our current timeline. But, Fallout takes place in a universe where the culture was kind of stuck in the 1950s optimistic bubble of atomic American futurism. And this is the pre-apocalyptic setting of the Fallout series. This is the dream of the boomers' parents realized. And here on this channel, I take my media illiteracy quite seriously. So people have been talking about Death of the Author recently, and look, regardless of whatever the writers intended in terms of a satire of capitalism or American patriotism, when I'm playing Fallout New Vegas, fully modded and customized to my tastes, with maximum immersion, zero HUD, and in-game, it's a cold night, and I'm slowly moving through the desert in this broken road. I come up behind an old burned-out car, and using my customized lean function on my controller, I peek over the corner, and I see a group of raiders patrolling. There's a radio somewhere in the distance playing an old Hank Williams country song. I take a deep breath and I just listen to the ambient sound, the crickets, the distinct absence of light on the horizon except for the warm glow of the New Vegas Strip. The Angelo Badalamenti-style music in the soundtrack, this eerie synth line playing, contrasting with the upbeat jingle of the country song on the radio, a unique atmosphere is achieved. It's like I'm living in the dead dream of the boomers' parents. It's like if their dream was a place, then in that moment, I inhabit it. And it's sad. And suddenly, instead of New Vegas being a tranny game, it's this bittersweet lament for heritage America and its naive, optimistic vision of the perfect society of the future. And it's interesting, even in the in-game lore, there's a name for this phenomenon, this bitter nostalgia felt by the survivors of the apocalypse that dwell beyond the end of history. Old world blues. It's almost a mental disorder in that you're wandering through the ruins of such opulence, such prosperity, such a positive utopian vision for America, and yet it's all been reduced to rubble. The heart yearns in bargaining for a way to go back somehow. Please, God, let it all just be a bad dream. How many Zoomers feel like this? In our contemporary society, I wonder. This aching nostalgia for a place and time that may or may not have ever even existed. This kind of experience is why I love New Vegas. It's why I love gaming. Boys are born for games. Men love games, even into adulthood, right? But from Texas Hold'em to tennis to Raido Kuzunoa versus King Abaddon or whatever, these games are simply dress rehearsals for the real thing. The constant and unrelenting state of war that encapsulates the very essence of life itself. There is simply no escaping it, let alone denying it, right? But, I guess that's what the boomers are all about. A denial of the true nature of reality, a willingness to live in delusion. Boomerism is a mindset. These days, people are so placated by the creature comforts of modernity and the infantilizing narratives of liberalism that, on some level, they've been convinced life is a game with the lowest stakes imaginable. Yes, the revolutionary boomers fucking hate their parents, but they also are a unique generation in that they are not interested in passing on the torch of prosperity and of civilization to their children. The revolution always eats its children. It's like that painting, Saturn Devouring His Son, by Francisco Goya. The glory of Rome standing for over 1,000 years, but the boomer post-World War II, post-national, open society, quote-unquote, can't last a measly 100 years before imploding under its own irrational decrepitude. We want to know what happened to our legacy. What happened to our safe, high-trust societies? What happened to our future? These are serious questions that deserve to be answered. And in classic form, the boomers don't want to go there. They don't even want to have the conversation. They don't even believe that multiple generations of young men in the Western world who are obviously struggling under the weight of liberalism, globalization, inflation, mass immigration, feminism, neo-Marxism, institutional anti-whiteism, these boomers believe that we don't even have the right to complain about any of this stuff, as if these things aren't massive obstacles that men of these younger generations face, and they're barriers to success that didn't even exist during the heyday of the eternal boomer. The boomers created these problems for us through acts of intentional economic and cultural sabotage, or, just the passivity of simply sitting there and watching your children's future robbed from them, only to declare without a hint of irony, "What do I care about the future? I'll be dead anyway." The great nations of the Western world strip-mined, while the boomer sits contented, vaguely amused at the notion that their own children, especially the male children, will suffer and struggle into a benighted future under the cruel and perverse authority of civilizational traitors and aliens. What is wrong with these people? This is a question that's been on my mind recently as I revisit Fallout New Vegas and recall just how much the boomers hate video games, because of course it's not their culture. They are cultural chauvinists, utterly convinced of the profundity of their own brand of 1960s subversive Zog slop.